Okay, so you see diencephalon here. You can see from the view of the brain here, it's deep within the center. Okay, and in fact, there are different structures to the diencephalon. So therefore, the diencephalon is not a structure, but it's a group of many different structures. Okay, one of the structures is this oval-shaped structure. Oval, sort of like egg-shaped structure. You can see that it's shaded in different colors. So that structure that you have there in the diencephalon that has that oval shape is called the thalamus. Now the thalamus is considered to be the gateway to the cerebral cortex. Kind of like the Grand Central Station or Grand Central Terminal in Manhattan, like a gateway to various locations, right? You can go from there upstate, or you can go from there downtown to Queens, to New Jersey, and so forth. So this thalamus here, which we find in the diencephalon, is like the gateway of the cerebral cortex, a gateway to the cerebral cortex that we saw earlier today, like a main entrance. All right, so now let's take a look at another part here of the diencephalon, and somewhere above this thalamus, there's a structure there. It's not drawn here with this figure, but there are other figures that show it. So I'll draw something that represents that structure. And it kind of looks like a long worm-like structure like this. Okay, something like that that sits above the thalamus. So because of its location, we call this the epithalamus. Oops, epithalamus. Okay, so epithalamus. That's a structure there that sits just above the thalamus. Now, one part of the epithalamus is this posterior portion, the part that's way to the back of the epithalamus. This portion that looks like a bulb, that looks like a sort of a balloon, right? Can we see it with the figure right below it? Yes, that's this right here. What you see right there, known as the pineal gland. Okay, so the pineal gland is actually part of the epithalamus. Okay, what does the pineal gland do? Anyone remember? It produces something important. Okay, we discussed it in lab class. And what does the pineal gland produce? Yes, nobody? Okay, you're in the right direction. Yes, it's a hormone, but what hormone specifically? We've only discussed this semester really one hormone so far. Other hormones we'll discuss at the end of the semester. But the pineal gland produces an important hormone called
melatonin.
Melatonin. Yes, melatonin, which actually causes sleepiness. Okay, which causes sleepiness. Now, we produce more melatonin as it gets darker. So when it gets darker, we produce lots of melatonin, and that causes our body, our brain, to become sleepy, and it induces and it promotes sleepiness. So that's the pineal gland, which is a part of the epithalamus. Okay? All right, good. And here on the figure below, you can see that part of the epithalamus called pineal gland. Now, the rest of the epithalamus really doesn't have different names. It's just epithalamus in general. But that last portion here that I just reviewed with you has an importance, and it produces an important hormone. Okay, so now we can move on to the last part here of the diencephalon, and that's this lower portion here. So this would be, by the way, this right here is your thalamus. Let me draw a circle. That's the thalamus. And right below the thalamus, you have this area. the word that reminds us that it's below it. The word is hypothalamus. So this whole area that you see here is shaded in different colors. Now, why is it shaded in so many colors? Because each of these specific parts has a role. However, I'm not gonna ask you to remember exactly what part of the hypothalamus is for a specific role and what parts for a different role. No, just know all the different things and functions of the hypothalamus. So let's take a look at the hypothalamus. One thing that you can see here with the hypothalamus is that it is, as you see right here, closely associated to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland. Okay? So, does it have any role there with the pituitary gland? Of course, because of a very close relationship to the pituitary gland. Therefore, the hypothalamus does have an important role over the pituitary. And what it does is that it regulates and controls, to some extent, the pituitary gland of the endocrine system. Therefore, hypothalamus is a major control center of the endocrine system. Major control center of the endocrine system. Okay. Also, it is a major control center of the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. So the hypothalamus, as you can see, is like the hard drive of the endocrine system, right? It controls it, and also the autonomic nervous system. A few other things that the hypothalamus does. The hypothalamus also produces two important hormones. It produces, well, actually, it produces many hormones, but it produces two very important hormones. One of them is called ADH. Let me type that down. ADH. Okay, and another hormone that it produces is a hormone called oxytocin. ADH and oxytocin. Now, ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. What the hormone does is it helps your body conserve water. Helps your body conserve water by reabsorption of water at the kidneys. We will take a closer look at ADH in the endocrine system near the end of the course. So ADH, antidiuretic hormone, helps conservation of water. Okay, again, helps in the conservation of water. Oxytocin, by the way, also produced by the hypothalamus, has a different role. Any idea what oxytocin does? Those of you who are planning to go into the field of midwifery, you will learn that right away. And it's important for labor contractions. Yes, it causes contractions of the uterus. Contractions of the uterus. Now, in the endocrine system, we'll discuss some more specific functions of oxytocin, but however, that would be one major function, would be contraction of the uterus, especially during labor, when a woman is having childbirth. Okay, so those are a couple of things here produced by the hypothalamus. Now, then the hypothalamus has many other roles. Many of those roles might be listed here on the table, okay? But let me summarize them for you. First of all, it's involved in thermoregulation. Thermoregulation means regulating body temperature. Thermoregulation. Also, it regulates food and water intake. Also regulates sleep rhythms. And emotional and sexual behavior. Okay, so those are many of the things that the hypothalamus regulates: temperature, food and water intake, sleep rhythms, emotional and sexual behavior. Okay, besides the other few things that we mentioned that it does as well. Okay, so that covers the three parts here, the three most important parts of the diencephalon. But now let's move on to this next part of the brain. Okay, so we saw already the cerebrum, and then we saw the diencephalon. But let's take a look at this next important part of the brain. And this part of the brain that you see on the figure is located here posterior and inferior to the cerebrum. Okay, it's called the cerebellum. The cerebellum. Okay, now if you look at the cerebellum, it also does consist of two halves, right? Two halves described here as cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, in between the cerebellar hemispheres, there's this worm-like structure, sort of like, looks like a worm-like shaped structure there that connects both halves. We call that the vermis. The word vermis, I believe it's Latin. It means worm. Okay, so that connects both halves of the cerebellum. Now, inside the cerebellum, if you dissect the cerebellum in half and you look inside, you see that it has this white sort of branchy tree-like appearance. Looks like a short, branchy tree. Those white lines that you see there, or white branches, make up the white matter of the cerebellum. The white matter of the cerebellum that we have on this diagram is labeled as the arbor vitae. So that is the name of the white matter of the cerebellum, the arbor vitae. Now, those of you who were present in lab class on Monday, who can tell me what the word arbor vitae means? From what we discussed in lab class. Yes, so it means the tree of life. Okay, tree of life. Okay, good. Now, why is it referred to as tree of life? Because of some of its important roles. And what role it has is that the tree of life and the cerebellum in general, is associated with motor coordination and balance. Motor coordination and balance. Okay? So that would mean that when a person has damage or injury to the cerebellum, they often might have incapacity to maintain balance or problems with motor coordination. Simple things like even taking one step at a time for walking, or perhaps typing or moving your arms in a specific manner. Okay, so that is because it's associated here with this part of the brain called the cerebellum. Okay, now we want to move on further though. Let's move on to this last part of the brain. This last part of the brain that you see here is the brain stem. Now with the figure here, you can see three important parts to the brain stem. However, let's see if I have a better image to show us more specifically brain stem. Okay, so let me see if I can find that image. Okay, we could use this image just as well as, however, all right, this is a good figure. And here we can see with this figure, figure 14.2, okay, the three parts of the brainstem. So these parts, let me put a bracket there. Okay, are the three parts of the brain stem. Now I think you got an idea why it's called brain stem. Okay, if you look at it, it kind of looks like the stem of some plant or vegetable, right? Like vegetables, like a, vegetables or fruits will have a stem there that holds up the whole thing, or holds it above the ground, like broccoli or cauliflower. Okay, anyway, that brainstem consists of three structures or areas. First, up here, we have the midbrain. The midbrain. Now let me see if I have another finer picture of the midbrain. And here we have the parts of the brainstem in color. Okay, you see right there it says midbrain. Okay, so let's look at the brainstem, and let me put a bracket around it as well, since we're discussing the brainstem specifically. Okay, so the midbrain. Now the midbrain is that upper portion of the brainstem. Okay, now I'm using figure 14.8, and there in the midbrain, to understand what roles it has is to take a look at these specific parts. So there in the midbrain, we have this bumpy area. Okay, this is on the posterior surface, and you see right there 4 different bumps. Okay, 4 different bumps. Now, this is called quadrigemina because of the 4 bumps. Quad means 4. Let me write that down for you. Okay, on this, I'll put it on this side since there's no space on the other side. It's called the corpora, which means body. Quadrigemina. Okay, yes, this has really is made up of these 4 bumps that you see right there. So now let's take a look at these 4 bumps. Now, there's 2 on the right side and 2 on the left side. So altogether it adds up to 4. Now, the 2 upper bumps, these 2 upper ones are called superior colliculus or colliculi, and that is written there on the diagram. Superior colliculus. Now the superior colliculus, this one is associated, this one has a role with visual reflexes and attention. Visual reflexes and attention. So often it happens, like such as you're doing something or you're at home and all of a sudden you see lights flashing. It catches your attention. Or perhaps that you see lights flashing outside from your window and you get up to see what's going on. Okay, so that is because of the superior colliculi, which actually maintains visual attention and reflexes. Okay, whereas the other colliculus, the 2 lower bumps that you have here, these 2 lower bumps, one on each half, one on the right and one on the left half, are called the inferior colliculus. Inferior colliculus. Now, again, the word colliculus is singular. Colliculi with the I at the end would be plural. So altogether you have 4 colliculi. The inferior colliculus, which is these 2 lower bumps, these are for the auditory reflexes. Auditory reflex. Okay? So for instance, you hear that and it catches your attention. That's because of the inferior colliculi. Okay, so there, one important thing that we have here in the midbrain is these bumps there that are called colliculi, and what they're associated with is the reflexes of these fine senses, like visual and auditory reflexes. Okay, and that's found there within these bumps of the corpora quadrigemina. Okay, so let's move on now to another structure of the brainstem, and go down here to this area of the brainstem. Okay, and that area that see looks like a big bump on the upper figure, you see it as well. Okay, is called the pons. Oh yes, one last thing before we move on. We do have one other important thing here in the midbrain, and it's not seen with this figure, so let me show you with another figure. We'll get back to the pons in a moment, but look at this figure, figure 14.9. You see right here, within the midbrain, if we cut it from a transverse view like this, we cut with a knife like this, transversely, and we look inside, you see a dark, sort of looks like these dark eyebrows. Okay, this dark sort of arched structure there. That dark structure that you see there is called the substantia, the substantia nigra. It is also part of the midbrain, the substantia nigra. What the substantia nigra does is that it produces dopamine. Okay, so let me write that word down. produces the dopamine. Okay, if you remember what dopamine was, whoops, I spelled it incorrectly. Let me try again. Dopamine, if you remembered, it's an important chemical. What sort of chemical is dopamine? Anyone remember? It was our list of important nervous system chemicals that we refer to as what? It's a neurotransmitter, right? All right, good. So dopamine is an important neurotransmitter. Now, this is the next question. The substantia nigra, which produces dopamine, again, is located here in the midbrain. That dopamine does an important thing. And what it does is that it regulates an important group of nuclei in the brain. It regulates a group of nuclei in the brain called the basal nuclei. Okay? It regulates the basal nuclei of the brain. Now, where are the basal nuclei? We'll take a look at the basal nuclei in a few moments. But dopamine is an important neurotransmitter that regulates the basal nuclei. So when we learn the function of the basal nuclei, you will then understand what the importance of dopamine is for. Okay? So keep that on hold and we'll get to that in a moment. All right, so now let's move on to the next part that we mentioned here, the pons, right? Or the this part of the brainstem called the pons. Okay, with my other figure, I can show you here as well. The pons is this bump here, these two large bumps, also shaded in green here. And really, the most important thing about the pons, and here's the pons again, this bump. And the most important thing about the pons is that it runs tracts right through it. It runs tracts. What are tracts? Anyone remember? It runs tracts right through it. Not railroad tracks, but what type of tracts run through this? What are tracts here in the central nervous system? What are they? They are what? Okay, they're bundles of axons, right? Bundles of axons. So bundles of axons in the central nervous system will run right through the pons there. These bundles are referred to as tracts. Okay, so now let's move on to my last part here of the brainstem, and that's the medulla oblongata. Now, medulla oblongata can just be simplified as just medulla. Okay, so you can call medulla oblongata just simply the medulla. Okay, so here's a view of the medulla. Okay, and if I use the other diagram from a moment ago, right here, you would see that this would be the medulla oblongata. Now, in the medulla, we have several things. Let's take a look at the medulla. Let's dissect it and look at it more closely with that colored diagram right here. And you see right there in the medulla that we have these things called pyramids. The pyramids. Okay. Now, in the pyramids, and we can appreciate that as well with this diagram, figure 14.9. Here you can see the pyramids with this part of the medulla, the pyramids, okay? And what you see that will mostly happen at the pyramids is that we will have there the crossing over of descending motor tracts. So most motor tracts, when they come down the brainstem, right, they will cross over here at the pyramids of the medulla. Okay, so this is where descending motor fibers decussate. Let me write that down. In fact, let me draw it. Let me draw some lines here. If I can make this larger, just so I draw the lines carefully. And let me use a red color. Okay, and there you see that I drew some X's. So a lot of the motor tracks that are coming down the brainstem and then go into the spinal cord are crossing over here at the medulla. So what do we call that? We say that when the tracks cross over, or when signals cross over to the opposite side, we say that that is something referred to as decussation. So descendant motor fibers and tracks decussate here. Let me spell that for you. Decussation. Okay, decussation or decussate means to cross over to the opposite side. Okay, and that is the reason why with one side of your brain you actually control the other half of your body, right? And that's because motor tracts, descendant motor fibers will cross over here, mainly here at the pyramids. Okay, now a few other things we find here at the medulla besides that. As you can see, we have different nuclei here within the medulla oblongata. There's nuclei here and there and so many other nuclei. But I won't expect you to learn exactly these different nuclei, but mainly the functions associated with the medulla. So which are some of the functions associated here? Well, in the medulla, there is a cardiac center. The cardiac center, which regulates heart contraction and force. Regulates heart contraction, heart rate, and force. So that we call the cardiac center. Okay, let me type that down. Some of the things found in the medulla. Cardiac center. Okay, so that regulates your heart function. Another center that we find here in the medulla is that we also find respiratory centers. Respiratory centers that regulate your breathing rhythm and depth, right? So that's in the respiratory centers found here in the medulla. Okay, another important center that we find there is vasomotor centers. Vasomotor centers. Vasomotor centers regulate blood flow and blood pressure. And lastly, we have various other centers. Other centers. Okay? We have various other smaller centers, but are just as lively in your physiology, in your lifetime. Centers such as cough centers and sneeze centers, vomit centers, and so on. So those are some of the other centers also found here within the medulla oblongata. Cough, sneezing, vomiting centers, and so on. Okay, so that would then therefore conclude the material for the brainstem. Okay, for the brainstem. All right, so what I want to move on though is to other areas of the brain and functions. So let's take a look at something in the brain that is referred to as, let me see if it's this one. Actually, no, this is not it. I'm finding the right figure. We'll talk about this as well, but something that we mentioned a moment ago. Remember, we mentioned it just a few moments ago, was called the basal nuclei. So with this figure, okay, figure 1417, we can use this figure to appreciate the basal nuclei. Okay, now here is the structures of the basal nuclei. Okay, let me underline some of the, or actually circle these structures here that make up the basal nuclei. Okay, with a red line. Okay, so you see right there, I circled these structures there. Those represent the structures that make up here the basal nuclei. The caudate nucleus, putamen, and the globus pallidus. So let me write that word down as well. Basal nuclei. Now, in the past, maybe uh, over 60 years ago, 70 years ago, sometimes these basal nuclei were referred to as ganglia. However, you know the true meaning of ganglia now. Ganglia means a group of neuron bodies outside of the central nervous system. But these, as you can see here, are located within the brain, therefore within the central nervous system, and therefore we have to correctly name it as basal nuclei instead. But if you run into the word basal ganglia, if you ever run into the word, it refers to these same structures. Okay. Anyway, basal nuclei would be the correct name though. So these three structures make this group of nuclei called basal. Now, what the basal nuclei does is that it regulates motor control of start and stop movements. Motor control of start and stop movements. Now, you might be confused. What do you mean by start? What do you mean by stop? You might be confused because to us it seems normal and it seems very simple to start a movement and to stop a movement. However, there are medical conditions where a person cannot start a movement or a person cannot stop a movement, right? So that might seem simple to us, but it isn't in many medical conditions. Now, basal nuclei therefore regulates movement by helping to start and stop movements. But the basal nuclei is controlled and regulated by a hormone, or I'm sorry, by a neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter that regulates the basal nuclei was a neurotransmitter that came from where? Okay. It came from, right, from the substantia nigra. Okay, very good. And the substantia nigra produced this neurotransmitter that regulates this. That's called dopamine. Very good. So dopamine regulates the basal nuclei, and the basal nuclei therefore can carry out start and stop movements. Now, again, it might seem simple to us to start and stop a movement. You start writing when you want. You stop a movement when you need to stop it, right? However, there are medical conditions where the lack of dopamine actually affects the ability to control the basal nuclei. What medical condition are you familiar with that is associated with lack of dopamine and therefore having difficulty starting or stopping movements? What medical disease or nervous system disorder? Obsessive compulsive disorder? No, not quite. And obsessive compulsive disorder is more of a psychological medical condition. Multiple sclerosis. That was a good guess, but not quite. Multiple sclerosis, people do have the ability to still control. Parkinson's disease, correct. That was the one I was looking for. And there are other Parkinson-like diseases as well. But Parkinson's disease, if you look at patients with that disease, you see that they really cannot stop their movements. They start shaking and their bodies and their arms and fingers and hands shake unstoppably. Okay? Or sometimes when a person has to start writing, right? A person with Parkinson's starts writing, right? They need to start writing and they don't begin until you give them a push, until you guide their hand and they start to write. But then what happens? They start shaking. So as you can see, their movements are affected greatly when basal nuclei is not being regulated by dopamine. Okay, so that is the importance of the basal nuclei. All right, so what I want to move on to though now, yes, if you have a question, Gavin, you could type it or just, yes.
So does the dopamine like increase the activity of these basal nuclei, or does it decrease the activity?
It actually regulates it, neither decrease or increase, just simply keeps the basal nuclei working properly. Just like oil you put on your bicycle chain so that the chain works properly. Without oil, it gets squeaky, right? Same thing. This just keeps the basal nuclei working in the right way. Okay? All right, so what I want to move on though to now is a group of structures that we refer to as the limbic system. So right here, figure 1416, you see some group of structures there shaded in blue purplish color. Okay, that is a group of structures that we refer to as the limbic system. Now I know that you see many structures there. You don't need to worry about every single structure of this system. It's called limbic system. However, a few of you I'll point out because you may have heard of before, such as you've heard of the hippocampus. And if you have not, you'll learn about the hippocampus in a moment. But structures like the hippocampus that you see down here, okay, the mammillary bodies, okay, the amygdala. These are some important areas here of the limbic system. Now, what the limbic system does, though, is that the limbic system is involved with memory, but just simply memory? No. What the limbic system does is that it links memory with learning and with emotions. It links memory with learning and emotions. Okay, so now that gives you the full picture of the limbic system. If you're wondering how does it link memory with these things, well, memory and learning, right, go together very well. Often to learn things, you might have to use a sense of memory, okay? However, what about linking memory with emotions? Well, that is an important role also of the limbic system. It links memory with learning and also with emotions. And emotions, how do I explain that? Well, let me give you an example. For instance, you may remember of a time in your life when you were able to reunite with one of your closest friends or relatives, right? And you had a party with your friend and relative, and there was some favorite songs playing during that party, okay? And then your friend or relative had to go away again, had to leave and go back to their state, their city, or their country, okay? Now, you might remember that through different things, such as, for instance, you hear that song or you hear those songs that were played at the party when your relative or friend came to visit you after years, right? And you hear that song and it reminds you and it brings you memory of that party that reunited you with your friend, okay? And it brings back memories and it brings back a smile, okay? So an emotion, okay? Some sort of emotion, whether it's happiness, other emotions as well. Perhaps you had an encounter with someone, and every time you pass that place where you had an encounter with that person, you remember that person, and it brings you back a bad memory, and you begin to get angry again. Okay? And then for some reason you start pounding on the wall or cursing, whatever. However, not a good way to control your emotions, but you get the idea how memory is linked with emotions, right? It brings back a memory of some event that happened or someone or something, and it brings back some type of emotional experience. All right, so that's what the limbic system does. It will link memory with these different other things. Okay, so now I want to move on though to another area here of the brain. And in fact, it's not so much of an area or a structure, but rather a group of loosely held structures, okay? Okay, let me see if I can find that diagram. I saw it just a moment ago. It had some lines there. And then we'll move on. This is it. No. Okay, so oh, here it is. It's something that we refer to as the reticular formation. Let me write that down here. Figure 1410 is the diagram that corresponds to the reticular formation. Okay, so what is a reticular formation? It's actually a group of pathways and structures that are loosely held together. So you see right here some lines and structures here, especially these red lines that you see here that refer to the reticular formation. A group of structures and pathways that are loosely held together. Now what these pathways do is that they process different things. So let's look at the things that the reticular formation processes. First of all, one important thing that the reticular formation processes is that it processes pain modulation. Pain modulation. Okay? So therefore, unfortunately, we all feel pain at some point in our life, and that pain is modulated, right? Is governed by the reticular formation. So if you want to get rid of pain, you would have to get rid of the reticular formation. However, you would lose a lot of other abilities as well. Okay? So are there treatments to manage pain? Yes, there are pain management and therapies. And a lot of it has to do with trying to manage and regulate the reticular formation. Anyway, does the reticular formation do other things? Yes. Another thing that it does is that it does carry out and process something called habituation. Let me write that word down right underneath reticular formation, and it's called habituation. Habituation. Now, habituation refers to the process of the brain ignoring repetitive, continuous stimuli while remaining sensitive, right? While remaining sensitive to other abilities. Again, the process of the brain ignoring repetitive, continuous stimuli while remaining sensitive to other abilities. So let me give you an example so you get the sense of the definition of what habituation is. Okay, you perhaps lie in bed, and when you lie in bed, you hear the clock tick-tocking, right? Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. So as soon as you go into bed and into your bedroom, you hear the clock ticking. Okay? At first, it might seem a little annoying, but after a few seconds, after a minute or so, right, your brain starts to ignore that repetitive continuous stimulus, the ticking and tocking of your clock. And then after a while, your brain has ignored it so much that it's almost your ear no longer perceives it or hears it. Okay? In reality, yes, the sound is still there, but your brain has learned to ignore that, and therefore you no longer perceive that stimulus, and you start to slowly fall asleep. Now, you can hear the sound at any time that you consciously and voluntarily put your hearing on the clock again. But this is how many times we actually, uh, over time, we adapt to the different senses that encounter us throughout the day, such as not only with sound, but also with visual stimuli, with touch stimuli, smell, taste, and so on. Okay, so all sorts of stimuli can be ignored after a while of continuous stimulation. And it's ignored because of this process that is controlled by the reticular formation. Okay, so those are a few things here associated with the reticular formation, being able to ignore continuous repetitive stimuli and also pain. All right, so that covers now the major functions and parts of the brain. Now, what I want to move on to lastly is what we have at the last half of the chapter here, in chapter 14, and go into this figure. Well, actually, we talked about the hemispheres already. Okay, but here with the figure 1426, we see here on this figure, and this is a good figure to also use at the same time with your lab review of the cranial nerves. This is the figure here in the textbook that discusses and it shows us the cranial nerves. Okay. Now, first question is, how many cranial nerves are there? And you can give me the number in just simple Arabic numeral. How many cranial nerves are there? Again, 12 pairs. Okay, very good. Once again, you're confusing it with the spinal nerves. We're talking about the cranial nerve. There are 12 cranial nerve pairs. Okay, so as you can see, they come in pairs. Okay, one for each side of the body, right? The two olfactory nerves, two optic nerves, and so on and so on. So altogether, 12 cranial nerve pairs. Now, these cranial nerves are numbered using what numerical system? What numerical system is used to number the cranial nerves? Roman numerals. Okay, very good. Roman numerals. So we'll use Roman numerals. Now, if you're not familiar with Roman numerals, you only have to really remember the first 12 Roman numerals from 1 to 12. And it's not too difficult, and you can just learn it from looking at the diagram, right? For instance, a 3 is 2 lines, like the oculomotor nerve. 3 lines that look like letter L's. A 5 is a V. A 10 is an X. And the rest really just are associated with those few letters or Roman numerals, okay? Okay, so that's not too difficult. You can find a way to remember that. However, there are 12 cranial nerves, and it begins over here with the first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve. Now, at the very tip of the olfactory nerve, there's a sort of bump or a knob. That's called the olfactory bulb. It is part of the nerve. Sometimes the nerve is called the olfactory tract. Okay, so olfactory nerve, olfactory tract are used interchangeably for this nerve. Okay, but what the nerve does is that this is a purely sensory nerve, provides purely sensory function. And it provides sensory function for what? What sense is provided by this nerve? The sense of smell. Okay, good. So you have here a diagram that shows you the inferior part of the brain, right? And you can see all the 12 cranial nerves here from 1 to 12. However, on the following diagrams, this is figure 1426, on the following diagrams, you do have here nicer views, sagittal views and transverse views of the different cranial nerves. You do have also on these tables, this is on table 14.1, okay, you do also have some other information, such as it says here, this is a purely sensory nerve for the sense of smell. So besides learning the number and the name of the nerve, which you have up here, let me underline that. Learn the Roman numeral, the name. Also learn its composition, meaning if it is either sensory, if it is mainly motor, or if it is both, mixed, right? Motor and sensory. But also you should have an idea of the function, okay? So these are the few things that you should review with the nerves, the cranial nerves. The number, the name, the composition, meaning if it's sensory or motor, and its functions, okay? So then you go down the list or the table, and you continue with the next nerve, okay? Some of them are purely sensory, like the olfactory, which is for smell, and sensory, which is for vision, okay? The nerve for vision is the optic nerve, the second one, which you see right there highlighted on the figure as well. Okay, then you continue with the next set of nerves and you continue through the list. Now, I've compiled a list for you with all not all of the information, but with the important things that you need to know for the cranial nerves. Mainly the number, the name, the composition, whether it's sensory, motor, and then the functions of the nerves, okay? And that was something that I included there on a table. Now the table I included there, and I also uploaded it there on Blackboard in your contents. And it should say the cranial nerves on your table. So look in your lecture contents, and you'll find there the 12 cranial nerves. Okay, with a nice table. Let me see if I can show you the table quickly, what it looks like. It's a simple one-page table that has all of the cranial nerves on just one sheet. Here's the sheet, okay? And you can either print that out or just save it on your device or computer and review that. Now, you do have one thing here that I'm not going to ask you to worry about. You don't have to worry about this, the origin. The origin is only for you to locate it quickly on brain pictures. So on the brain picture that you saw, you will find that the origin is where it's really located. So I'm going to cross that out here. Let me use a line here. And you don't have to worry about the origin here of the nerves, okay? Really the name, the type, if it's sensory motor, which said on the figures there in the book as the composition, and the functions, right? The function which is associated with the distribution. So for instance, smell, right, which is associated with your epithelium for smell, right, which is in the nasal cavity, vision in the eye, and so forth. So this is really what you need to review. Now, going back to the figures, though, the figures are nice there. So you can have your table there. This table, this handout, together with your pictures, which makes it nice to remember. Okay. Let me go back to the figure again. And let's take a look at a few others. Okay, so cranial nerves, that's at the near the second half of this chapter, table 14.1. And once again, we can see the olfactory and the optic nerves. Then we have there, well, these are just larger views of the same nerves. Then we have here the oculomotor nerve, okay, the third nerve. Oculomotor means for most movement of your eyeball, okay? However, it's predominantly motor, this nerve, by the way, mostly motor. But also, we have a few other nerves involved for a specific movement of the eye, such as the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve is also motor, and it's for a specific type of eye movement. The specific eye movement is listed there on the handout, but you can also look here. It innervates, right, on this muscle, the superior oblique muscle, which is that muscle that you see right there. Let's see if I can make that larger. And right here you see the superior oblique muscle. Up here at the top, actually it would be the next diagram. Right there. Superior oblique muscle innervated by this fourth nerve, the trochlear nerve. What that muscle does is that it causes your eyes to lower laterally at the same time. So when you're looking, for instance, right now I'd like to try that. Just look straight at your computer screen. Now cover your left eye and just look at the screen with your right eye. Now, turn your eye immediately downward to the right corner. Not your head, just your eye. Turn your eyeball, your right eye, downward laterally, meaning outside, down and out. Can you see something on the floor? I can see a tennis ball on the floor. How about you? Can someone describe what you're seeing on the floor as you turn your eyeball downward laterally? What do you see? Maybe I can see a tennis ball. No one's doing the exercise? You see perhaps a socket, okay, a book, okay, good. Perhaps you see the table, table or a leg table, or maybe you see a toy. If you have pets at home, you might see a pet. Okay, so these are just different things. You see your dog, okay, great, a ball, so forth. Okay, good. So those are all examples of things that you're seeing when you turn your eyes downward laterally with the superior oblique muscle. Okay, all right, good. Now let's continue with our list here. Then we continue with other cranial nerves. Okay, and let's see what nerves we have here. We have here other nerves such as the abducens. Oh, we missed the trigeminal. This is, I believe, the trigeminal nerve. And the trigeminal nerve provides most sensation of your face. So when you feel a tap, a caress, a kiss on your face, an insect somewhere on your face, you're feeling it because of this trigeminal nerve. However, the trigeminal nerve is a mixed nerve, meaning, let me see if I have that on the table here. This is trigeminal. The trigeminal is a mixed nerve. It is sensory as well as motor. How is it motor? Well, it provides innervation to the muscles, especially the big muscle that you have there on the side of your cheeks for chewing. What is the muscle that you have there on the side of your cheeks that you use mainly for chewing? It's a muscle that's found on the mandible, and it's the muscle, have you forgotten muscles already? It's called the masseter. Let me show you with a picture. Okay, here's the masseter muscle. That muscle is innervated by part of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so the trigeminal nerve is not only sensory, but it is also motor. It's a mixed nerve. So many of the nerves that you'll go through are mixed nerves as well. They have motor and sensory function. Another example of a mixed nerve. By the way, the trigeminal nerve you see here is divided into 3 branches. An ophthalmic one for the eyes and upper face, a maxillary branch here for the upper teeth and cheeks, and then a lower branch here, the mandibular branch, which is the one that innervates your lower teeth, your lower mouth, and also does distribute innervation for movement of the muscles for chewing, especially that muscle called the masseter muscle, along with a few other minor muscles as well that we use for chewing, but the greatest one being the masseter. So then you move on to other nerves here of the list, and you will get to the facial nerve, which is also a mixed nerve. The facial nerve, which is for, let's take a look here. The facial nerve is also a mixed nerve. It provides movement for facial expressions, movement of the muscles of your face. See how this young lady has all the different muscles innervated. Okay, so when you smile or you frown, that's because of this nerve. But the facial nerve, it is a mixed nerve, so it does also provide sensation. And sensation to what? To taste with the anterior part of the tongue. Taste to the anterior part of the tongue. So tasting is a function of the facial nerve. And then you go through the list. We have here another nerve that is purely sensory. This is the auditory or vestibulocochlear nerve. Now, the word auditory can also be used. However, vestibulocochlear nerve gives you the full function of the nerve. What functions does this nerve have? It has 2 functions, a vestibular function and a cochlear function. So what do these 2 functions refer to? Balance is vestibular, correct, and cochlear is the part that gives your sense of hearing. So there are 2 functions here to the inner ear, which are innervated by the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibular branch for the sense of balance, and the cochlear nerve for the sense of hearing. Yes, equilibrium is the same as balance. All right, and then you continue down the list. We have here the glossopharyngeal nerve for tasting, with the posterior part of your tongue. So I thought you said tasten was anterior part of the tongue. No, tasten with the anterior is facial, and with the posterior part of the tongue mainly is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then you continue down the list. Then the 10th cranial nerve is vagus. Now vagus innervates mainly your visceral organs, such as your trachea and your airways, your lungs, heart, digestive organs, urinary organs, even reproductive organs. So that's the vagus. So vagus is very varied, a varied organ that, right, a varied nerve that innervates various organs. Okay, and then we have the, okay, we have two other nerves, the 11th cranial nerve, right? This is the accessory, and then the hypoglossal, the one that you see right here, okay? So on that table and handout, you can review all the different nerves and those important things that are listed. Now, in your book, you do have a lot of other things listed. You don't have to learn every single thing that you have here in this table for the cranial nerves. But the table is good because it shows you the figures and gives you a sense of where these nerves are located.